This is the story of Paul Le Roux, notorious programmer that developed software that still resides today on many people's hard drives in one form or another. There's a lot of mystery behind this story, and I wanted to introduce it. It's something I've wanted to talk about for a few years because it truly is something out of James Bond. This guy has a very impressive history. If it were not criminal, he would have been a very successful businessman. You may use something called Veracrypt. If you've ever heard of Veracrypt, it's an excellent encryption software option. Now, one thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is Veracrypt comes from TrueCrypt. Now, where does TrueCrypt come from? We can take a look at the timeline. We can also see that on the official TrueCrypt page, you'll see that around 2014 or so, they terminated TrueCrypt. Now, what else happened along that timeline? Well, around the same time was when Paul Le Roux was arrested. And Paul Le Roux is the developer of E for M, encryption for the masses, which TrueCrypt is based on, and Veracrypt is based on TrueCrypt. Now, this is one hell of a genius. This guy has a lot of interesting links and history that we're going to talk about today. Previously, in May, I talked about the story of the raid on the Illuminati card game company. And we talked about that hacker story. This is another hacker story, and I want to bring these out from time to time just to talk a little nostalgic history of the scene and some of the supergroups of the 1990s, like Cult of the Dead Cow, other groups like Legion of Doom. We may talk about those in future content, but today we're talking about Paul Le Roux. This gentleman was a genius. At an early age, he was interested in usenet, encryption, and privacy. Very fitting for the channel. It turned out, throughout this time, he also ended up creating his own militia. He started working to take over governments. Now, how did he get so powerful?
In 2004, he spotted a golden opportunity in the Philippines.
He set up a company. The call centers were in Manila. His business was online prescription drugs. They were high-volume drugs, Viagra, hair growth, tranquilizers.
How he got so powerful was being a pioneer of telemedicine. So this gentleman, Paul Le Roux, if I can call him a gentleman, he created some of the very first telemedicine, ability to order different types of prescriptions online. He had real doctors backing it all up, and he also took over parts of Africa, created and funded his own militias, was also even creating ballistic missile guidance systems for Iran. Now, E for M, encryption for the masses, much like TrueCrypt and Veracrypt, allowed you to have plausible deniability here. And the plausible deniability means that if someone were to force you to unlock a disk, you can also have false partitions and hidden operating systems, allowing you to give away a password, but it actually boots into an entirely different setup, protecting your files, continually encrypting them, even after giving up the password that was given to load up a false operating system. And so there's pretty advanced security features built into E for M that turned into TrueCrypt. Then finally, today, we have what is left of it as Veracrypt.
For more than 8 years, one man ran an astonishing criminal enterprise across Southeast Asia and around the world.
Telling you, my friend, everything you want. Even shit the world,
and you have to understand that criminals like Le Roux are in a league of their own.
Creating a global empire online, dealing in drugs, guns, and weapons of war.
This guy's out of the box. He's really a unique guy.
Tonight, for the first time, the true story of the big boss.
Everything is sweet. Everything is sweet.
That's Paul Le Roux. Starting out with RX Limited and his connections, and you have to wonder, he did smuggle gold into Hong Kong, and that was where he actually helped to launder his money. He stored a lot of gold in Hong Kong, and at the same time, he was able to run this entire operation by using spam emails to get people to buy this prescription medicine. But at the same time, he's selling this prescription medicine to U.S. citizens out of the reach of the United States government. Paul Le Roux was born in Rhodesia. His mother gave him up for adoption. He had an upbringing as a computer geek who loved privacy encryption. He wasn't a very social individual, though, more of an introvert that loved to code in his computers and loved development, and was taking programming courses. Not only did he run an online prescription business, he also operated call centers, employed former special operations soldiers from the U.S. military and the Israeli military as well.
He's an organized crime lord.
The shy boy turned away from the outside world, developing a precocious self-taught expertise in the emerging science of computer encryption.
So what Paul Le Roux has shown us is that if you want to operate as a successful organized crime syndicate in the 21st century, it is no longer enough to have just money power and muscle power. You also need a special set of skills which come in use online. You need to be good at encryption, you need to be able to understand cyberspace jurisdiction and how to exploit those holes in order to make massive profits.
So how did Paul Le Roux move his money? Then comes in Bitcoin. There's several different people that are suspects in being Satoshi Nakamoto. Now, Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonym for the creator of Bitcoin. Now, Hal Finney, pictured here, actually was an American software developer and cypherpunk, so he was interested in cryptography, privacy, and security. He also worked for the PGP Corporation at one point. Now, unfortunately, Hal Finney has passed away, rest in peace. Before he passed away, he did hand over the keys, his private keys, to his children, according to Hal Finney himself, that he has given over his keys so that his children will be able to benefit. Was Hal Finney Satoshi Nakamoto? Is Craig Wright Satoshi Nakamoto? Is Hal Finney Satoshi Nakamoto? Or is it even possible that Paul Le Roux himself could be Satoshi?
For that, he needed muscle. So he hired Israeli ex-Special Forces soldiers, men like Doron Shulman. Every week, a group led by Shulman would bring bags of cash from Manila and swap them for gold bars in Hong Kong.
Why would Le Roux consider gold bars? I suppose because gold bars are truly anonymous. It's very difficult to track. They're acceptable almost in many countries, especially third world countries, so it makes sense.
Once the cash had been laundered, the gold bars were stashed in safe houses across Hong Kong.
Would it not make sense for something like Bitcoin to be invented by this cryptographer and telemedicine guru who happened to be a pioneer in the telemedicine doctor shopping industry? The timeline of Paul Le Roux happened to be along the same timeline as the actions of Satoshi Nakamoto. So after Paul Le Roux was arrested, there was no more activity by Satoshi Nakamoto. And we also know that E for M was created by Paul Le Roux, another cryptography project, which he was very much into free and open source software. The guy had the I guess you could say the morals. I mean, obviously he did a lot of immoral things, but in his heart, he believed that encryption should be for the masses because of the concern of mass government surveillance, something we should all be concerned by, because what is important to note about totalitarian technology is, by definition, it forces anyone under the foot or the boot of that technology to behave in the way the owner of that technology wishes. So you have total control over the population when you implement totalitarian technology. Now, some may say, well, this is going to be used for good purposes, but how can you be sure? My belief and my thing behind the whole privacy and anonymity, all these things, you may not feel you need it, but it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And it's only going to be more likely that a totalitarian government will come to be if you build the tools for a totalitarian government, much like supplying a baker, as I like to use this analogy. If you supply a baker ingredients to bake only cakes, eventually that baker's going to build a cake. And you can say the same exact thing with this totalitarian technology that's rolling out with the mass surveillance, the former military contractors of U.S. Defense, and also highly involved Israeli surveillance is one of the most prominent. The companies developed over there under things like Unit 8200. If you're not familiar with Unit 8200, it's like the NSA for Israel. The only right that can protect all of your other rights is privacy. That's it. There's nothing else out there. There's no other right that can preserve your other rights.
Well, Hong Kong is an open city. From Hong Kong, in 3 hours, you can be almost anywhere you want to be in Asia. So it's a good communications hub. Banking system is efficient. It's a global financial hub. If you're a very big gangster, you probably don't want to put your ill-gotten gains somewhere where they're going to be stolen. Right? So Hong Kong, again, is secure. It has a rule of law, which is ironic in this case.
Le Roux couldn't risk using normal banks to hide his staggering profits, so he devised a system to transform all that cash into assets that he could hide from official scrutiny.
And there's even more evidence pointing to Paul Le Roux being the actual Satoshi, or at least part of it. My personal belief is there was a team involved, and this is another, one of these things, these theories that it's a good chance that it was more than one person working on it. In fact, the first person who received Bitcoin was Hal Finney from Satoshi Nakamoto. Now, what's interesting about this, and how I mentioned, remember what I said, that Paul Le Roux, if he is involved in Bitcoin, what's interesting about this, and Hal Finney being the first person to ever receive Bitcoin from Satoshi Nakamoto, well, it is officially signed by Hal Finney's keys, and it is well known that Hal Finney is the person who first received Bitcoin ever, and whoever sent it to Hal Finney, it could have been Hal Finney himself, but what's interesting is someone used Hal Finney's keys and signed a message saying the transaction was made by Paul Le Roux to Hal Finney. And what better way to handle your online pharmacy than to invent something like an electronic currency such as Bitcoin? He had all of the motive, he had the means, and he had the ability to create Bitcoin. Also was involved in the same mailing list that Hal Finney was involved with, and the keys that Hal Finney had mentioned passing along to his children have signed a message saying that the transaction was actually made by Paul Le Roux. Not only that, but Hal Finney, and what's interesting about Le Roux is Le Roux had used a false identity. Now, this false identity, what's very interesting about that false identity is the name is very close to Satoshi Nakamoto. So when you look at all of the facts, we look at the means, the access, the timeline, which lined right up, which of course we have Le Roux pled guilty in 2012, and of course TrueCrypt stopped working shortly after, or at least it stopped being developed, and he developed the precursor to, which was called E4M encryption for the masses, and also Satoshi Nakamoto stopped being active after he actually was arrested and jailed. So what's interesting there, we also have people like Craig Wright here. Now, Craig Wright has claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto. And so if Paul Le Roux was the creator of Bitcoin and Craig Wright was part of the investigation to go after him, would it not make sense that Craig Wright may be basing this based on the fact that he actually has access to the encrypted storage of Paul Le Roux? And I'm not just saying that as a wild guess. There's actually more evidence that points to Craig Wright having this. So there's actually a lawsuit that was filed, Kleiman versus Wright lawsuit, which actually has a motion for a protective order with an unredacted footnote called Document 187, which interestingly enough was an address to Paul Le Roux's Wikipedia page, directly linking him to Craig Wright in this lawsuit. So Paul Le Roux had some difficulty getting his money and his sales done privately. Now, we all know by now that Bitcoin is not the most anonymous of cryptocurrencies. I don't make it a big part of this channel, though, as I think that's better left to other channels to talk about, as it's not one of my biggest interests. I also see the justification for a CBDC, and I wouldn't even be surprised if banking was involved in creating Bitcoin itself in order to justify a CBDC. Now, that's just another possible theory, and we see that Paul Le Roux was operating pharmacies in a gray area, so he actually had real doctors writing these prescriptions, and a customer would write out a questionnaire to talk about their condition or their symptoms, and then a real US doctor would write that prescription and send it to a local pharmacy. So he was able to do all this while being stationed in the Philippines and also traveling the world, much of it in South Africa, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and also Israel. Interestingly enough, he also had some of his own Israeli employees that come up with their own online pharmacy as well and operate big call centers in Israel, which is known and connected to some of the more shadier areas of the online world in some cases. Of course, there's plenty of legitimate Israeli businessmen, but this particular story details some of the former special forces and intelligence people that were involved in Paul Le Roux's operation in order to do drug trafficking worldwide in an online way. And of course, you need something like a digital currency.
For that, he needed muscle. So he hired Israeli ex-special forces soldiers, men like Doron Shulman. Every week, a group led by Shulman would bring bags of cash from Manila and swap them for gold bars in Hong Kong.
Another piece of evidence that we have is that employees who actually worked with Paul Le Roux said that leading up to the introduction of Bitcoin and the release of Bitcoin, Paul Le Roux had been very interested in digital currencies in the months leading up to the Bitcoin release. And he had a group of Romanian programmers in the office, and they were talking about online currency. So during this time period, the few years before Bitcoin was actually introduced to the world, he was already working on an online currency with Romanian programmers along with himself, and he needed to be able to make his own currency. As Paul Le Roux once stated, if you want to make money, real money, you need to do like North Koreans who print it, which he's talking about counterfeits, or just make your own currency. And then shortly thereafter, 2009, while all this talking and developing of online currency is being done with Paul Le Roux and his Romanian programmers, we then see the very year after the release of Bitcoin, and it lines right up with the timeline in yet another way. And yet another similarity and piece of evidence linking Satoshi Nakamoto to Paul Le Roux was his own identity, his false identity, his Congolese identity card was named Solachi, which is very similar to Satoshi. Solachi, very, very similar to Satoshi. And we can see that the year here is 2008, the very year before the introduction of Bitcoin. Now, anyone who understands the human mind knows that we tend to come up with ideas, things and otherwise that we have from our mind. So things that we are thinking of, we may make a similar name to. It's just a natural thing to do because every idea we have comes from the ideas that we're working with. And this connects directly, in my opinion, strongly links another piece of evidence to Paul Le Roux being the inventor of Bitcoin, or at least being a big part of the invention of Bitcoin. My personal belief, it was done with a whole team of people. Now, it could be just two of them. It could have been Hal Finney and Paul Le Roux, and they're all involved in these usenet cryptography groups that are helping develop open source software to help bring encryption to the masses, and also we're working on, admittedly, with Romanian programmers just in 2000 and 2008, the year before Bitcoin's introduction, was the work on a digital currency, according to those who have written, journalists, very authentic journalism that happened to state these quotations from his former employees that he was in fact researching and developing a perfect digital currency that helped him with his online telemedicine and his ability to transfer funds, because it's not always easy to transfer giant gold bars everywhere.
Jones told the journalist that he had only realized too late that he had been working for criminals.
I believe him. I believe his story. According to him, he was just hired by the syndicate to load the guns from Indonesia. During the loading of the guns, it is being guarded by uniformed policemen in Indonesia. So he thought that it was really a legal transaction.
The fact that the Indonesian police had witnessed and apparently approved the loading of the guns allowed Bruce Jones to claim that he was not doing anything wrong. The British captain insisted that he was being made the fall guy in a scheme actually controlled by a powerful foreign criminal based in Manila.
You can also see some of these transactions here, and I want to remind you that we do have this message, this signature from Hal Finney's keys. The first person to ever receive Bitcoin was Hal Finney, and what's interestingly enough is the person, his family, I'm guessing, in control of his private keys, and if it wasn't his family who signed this message, it was probably someone he was working on Bitcoin with, because he was the first person to receive it, which means it was a test transaction, meaning they were testing out what they had created. They needed to do a transaction in order, and that would be the very first step if you were creating Bitcoin, would be to make a transfer. And we can see with this signature that it even says this signed message, it was made by Paul Le Roux to Hal Finney in 2009. Now, a couple years later, Paul Le Roux was arrested, and also we see the court documents showing that even Craig Wright, the person who claims to be the actual person who was behind Bitcoin, the actual Satoshi Nakamoto, we also see in his own court documents that he had linked in a unredacted portion of his court paper filings that there was actually a direct link to Paul Le Roux, and it is believed that Craig Wright may be working on breaking the encryption on Paul Le Roux's actual backups in order to gain access to that Bitcoin. Now, I hope you enjoyed this story, guys. Make sure to share it far and wide. Really is a big help, and I want to thank all of those who have supported this, whether you're sharing it, or you're linking it, or if you want to buy me a coffee, you can do that at bmc.link/politictech, and if you want to join the membership, hit membership button on there, and you can donate a coffee a month. It helps a lot, and it also gives you early access to these videos. Do you think Paul Le Roux was Satoshi Nakamoto? Do you think all of these links and interesting things, including a signed message using Hal Finney's private keys, the guy who received the very first Bitcoin, he also made a false identity that had Satoshi, which is very similar to Satoshi, the creator of Bitcoin. Share what you think. I personally believe Paul Le Roux was involved in the creation of Bitcoin. I don't know for sure, but all the evidence points to him above everyone else. So make sure to share the video, guys, like it, and let me know if you think that Paul Le Roux was Satoshi. Do you think Craig Wright was Satoshi? Do you think Hal Finney was Satoshi? Or do you think they worked together as a team? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and I will be back with more on how to protect your security and privacy.
How it's supposed to feel.